The Zoom Congregation Text, Context, Consequences, Part 5. In the previous episodes, we had begun to examine the text of the New Testament in relation to the structure of the congregations, always with the claim in mind, we are doing exactly as the Christians in the first century did. In doing so, we touched on the organization of the congregations and the topic of donations, as well as baptism and the peaceful coexistence. We could look at other specific aspects, but that would make this a rather long series. Let's rather take a look at the historical context of what we have read so far. In fact, the congregations did not arise in a vacuum, but in a very specific historical context with very specific needs of the disciples. Let us take a closer look at this context and then ask ourselves whether we have the same needs today and whether we can simply transfer everything to our own situation. We often tend to see the history of the followers of Jesus in the first century as a homogeneous thing, the first century congregation. As if there was only the one congregation in the first century that lived this way or that way. The following graphic is intended to show us some important aspects. And it's about the development over time. And you see here that's roughly the first century, starting from the birth of Jesus Christ and up to the year 100 AD. And I just depicted here schematically the time where Jesus lived. This is just the 3.5 years, or not where he lived, but during his public service here. And this is the 3.5 years. And then I just started here, for example, the life of Peter, who probably lived into the mid or end of 60s. James, a little bit less than probably, and Paul, who became a follower of Jesus Christ here later. And he also died about 60. What I also want to show is here that what we read in Acts 15, the so-called Council of Jerusalem, that was here before 50. And at 70, there's the destruction of Jerusalem. Now let's think of this graph as the length of 40-year generations. So someone who died at about the death of Jesus, if he had children with the age of 20, and then this generation with 40 years would live actually only until the Acts 15 event. And even their children were those who lived during the destruction of Jerusalem. And it was then the next generation which lived until the end of the century. So at the top, I've drawn these generations of 40 years each. And this helps to get us the better sense of how much time has really passed back then. Think about these things in terms of me, my father or mother, my grandfather, my grandmother, or my children and my grandchildren. How much do you know about your grandparents, for example? What did they tell you about their youth? For most of the followers of Jesus in the first century, the events in the life of Jesus were at best the accounts of the grandparents or in great-grandparents, this generation. And many were later pagans whose parents and even grandparents had not heard of Jesus, let alone met him. Perhaps we also have the idealistic idea of the congregation in Jerusalem in mind. This may be because we can read the text in the New Testament in minutes or a few hours. We completely lack a sense of the many years that pass in the accounts. And we have virtually no account of the second part of the first century in the New Testament. An apostle Peter, James, or the brother of Jesus, or an apostle Paul were no longer alive less than 3 decades after Jesus' death. It would be as if Jesus had been around in the early 1990s. And today, Peter, James, Paul, and others had passed away already. So if you were an adult already in 1990s, you may have heard of Jesus Christ, but now Peter, James, and Paul are already dead. And what happened in the time between? Perhaps as early as a year after Jesus' death, Stephen was stoned and the congregation in Jerusalem was scattered. That would have been even before the year 2000. The council at Jerusalem, so the event that described in Acts 15, would have been as early as 2010. And in a few years, the temple in Jerusalem will be destroyed. Then those in Jerusalem and Judea will have to flee. But before that, persecution by the world power of Rome has already begun. Meanwhile, the children and grandchildren have grown up and Jesus still has not returned. The gospel has been proclaimed throughout the Roman Empire, as far as Rome and beyond. Perhaps we are now aware of the changes that have taken place during this time and how the congregation has changed dramatically in the first century. It would also be interesting to take a closer look at how other apostles, or we would call them probably missionaries, and overseers were appointed after the 12 apostles. That is, after the time when these apostles still laid their hands on them. And was there already Moni Episcopacy in Rome? That is, the leadership of the congregation by a bishop? In the first 2 centuries, it cannot be said with certainty when and where there was a leadership by a group of elders and when one person in particular took the lead and was called a bishop. Could it be that we have an idealized notion of the congregation in the first century? One that never existed in this form in early Christianity? Incidentally, the German term which we use, Urchristentum, meaning early Christianity, first Christianity, or the original Christianity. This German term, Urchristentum, has only been used in German language literature since the 1800s, so at 1770. As you can read in the German Wikipedia. So perhaps this concept is not that much old. And we have not yet discussed the gradual detachment of Jesus' Jewish disciples from their religion, culture, and environment. Let's have a quick look at the social context. The structure and changes in the congregations of followers of Christ in the first century must also be viewed in their social context. I would like to recall just a few facts. Initially, the congregation in Jerusalem consisted only of Jews, and they were also initially perceived as such by others. It was only after some time that they could no longer go to the synagogues and the temple. In Acts 21, even at the end of that book, in Acts 21, verses 26, we read that Paul went with others to the temple in Jerusalem. It was only 7 days later that he was seen and arrested in the temple by Jews from the province of Asia. In the beginning, the 11 apostles personally chosen by Jesus were the most authoritative figures when it came to teaching about Jesus. Then James, the brother of Jesus, also appeared. As the congregation in Jerusalem grew and the gospel spread to other congregations, and as the apostles died, other elders had to take on their roles as overseers, even if they did not have the same authority. most of them could not read, let alone write. It had to be read out loud in the congregation, or someone had to quote either from the scriptures, which means the Old Testament, or from oral tradition. The oral tradition became more and more difficult because the eyewitnesses died. And then those who still knew the eyewitnesses. At some point, many had never met Jesus, nor any eyewitness, nor those who knew them. The various congregations had to deal with very different cultural contexts and local religions. Within the disciples from the Gentiles, completely new philosophical ideas and explanations came into the congregation that did not even exist in the Jewish context. Even if everyone heard the same thing, they did not necessarily understand the same thing because of their different personal backgrounds. And according to Acts chapter 1, verse 8, the apostles hoped that they would soon see the establishment of the kingdom. And Jesus did not tell them that it would not be so, only that it was not their business to know. So this hope remained. But the decades passed, and that raised the question, if we were wrong about this, what might we have misunderstood? As we have seen, the New Testament essentially describes the first half of the first century. How did the congregations develop? To answer that, we would also have to look at the other writings from that time. Then those of the Apostolic Fathers, so-called Apostolic Fathers, and the Patristic period. Although that would help us to better understand the development of the congregations, it is beyond the scope of this article in this series. In the next few episodes, I would like to take a closer look at just one important writing. Thank you very much for watching and listening, and goodbye.